Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I still remember the first night I dreamed of her so clearly that every detail was engraved in my brain. In the dream, I was standing in a dark room with only a faint moonlight shining through the window. Outside, it seemed to be raining lightly. The sound of water drops falling on the roof echoed like a heavy heartbeat. I turned around and saw a woman's figure standing silently by the window. She didn't turn around, but her long hair fell down, covering her face. I wanted to call out, but my throat was so tight that it felt like someone was squeezing it. When I woke up, my shirt was soaked in sweat. I tried to reassure myself that it was just a nightmare, but the next morning I received news that a familiar neighbor had suddenly passed away during the night due to a car accident. I felt a chill down my spine, not daring to think that the two events were related. I told my best friend, David. He just laughed and said that I had watched too many horror stories online and was haunted by myself. I wanted to believe it too, but the fear in my heart still hadn't subsided. The following days, I lived in a state of anxiety. I avoided sleeping late, avoided thinking about that woman's figure, but sleep always came no matter how I resisted. The second night I dreamed of her, the scene changed. This time, I stood in a long hallway with closed wooden doors. At the end of the hallway, that figure appeared again. With each step I tried to take closer, the entire hallway shook as if it was about to collapse. She slowly turned around, revealing half of her pale face with deep dark eyes like a deep abyss. I woke up, my heart pounding. The next day, I received news that a colleague at the company had a stroke in his office. He died before he could be taken to the emergency room. At that time, my suspicion turned into a certain fear. Every time I dreamed of that woman, someone around me would die the next day. I couldn't explain it, nor did I dare tell anyone for fear of being considered crazy. But the terrible thing was that I clearly felt the strange connection between dreams and reality. I started to have trouble sleeping. I drank coffee all night, turned on loud music, even took medicine to stay awake. But my body was exhausted. The third night, I still fell into the dream. This time, I was in a cemetery, surrounded by thousands of cold tombstones. The woman stood right next to a new grave, her white hands pointing straight at me. I screamed loudly to escape and woke up, my whole body shaking. The next morning, the news on the newspaper reported that an old teacher of mine suddenly died from a work accident. I sat there silently, my heart pounding as if it was about to burst. A feeling of helplessness enveloped me. I started to write down every detail of the dream, hoping to find some pattern. But the more I wrote, the clearer and more terrifying everything became. The woman never said a word, just quietly appeared, and each time she appeared, a soul left this world. I don't know why it was me. I don't know what she wanted. Every night I went to sleep was a gamble with someone's fate. I tried to find books on dream interpretation, and even folk tales related to the ghost of death. Some documents mentioned the silhouette of a woman in a dream as a sign of death, like a god of death in disguise. Some people called it omen woman, others considered it a curse from a generation. But all of it only made me more scared. The next night I dreamed of her again. The scene was an abandoned house. The windows were broken. The wind blew through the rotten wood cracks. She sat on an old chair in the middle of the room, her two hands holding a tattered doll. When I walked closer, The doll slowly turned its head and looked straight at me with its opaque glass eyes. I woke up to my own screams. And then, the next day, I received news that a female colleague I had talked to closely had died in a house fire. The coincidences were too numerous to be explained simply. I was in a state of panic. Every night before I went to sleep, I was afraid that death would come to someone I knew. I began to avoid people, afraid that if I dreamed of her, someone's life would be taken. The climax was a night of heavy rain when I collapsed on the table from exhaustion. In my dream, I saw the dark room again, and she stood with her back turned. But this time, she slowly turned around, approaching step by step. I could clearly see her deep, dark eyes, her mouth slightly opened, as if she was about to say something. I woke up with a start, my whole body trembling. I didn't know who would die tomorrow, but I knew for sure it would happen. And maybe next time, it wouldn't just be someone I knew, it could be me. I began to fear even before nightfall. Every time the sun went down, the obsession with sleeping rose up in me stronger than ever. I felt like I was on death row, waiting to close my eyes and knowing that someone was going to die just because I dreamed of her. I tried to seek help, tried to confide in a pastor near my house, but when I opened my mouth, my own mouth stopped. I was afraid that if I spoke, the horror would become more real. I was no longer myself. One evening, David came to visit me. He looked at me with concern, said I looked like a living ghost. I looked in the mirror, realized my face was gaunt, my eyes were dark, my spirit was weak. I no longer dared to sleep, no longer dared to let my body rest. David forced me to tell him everything. Finally, I confessed that every dream I had coincided with someone's death. He laughed at first, but when he saw my trembling and desperate eyes, his smile faded. That night, I collapsed on my chair, exhausted and unable to resist. In my dream, I saw myself standing on a long, dark staircase. The cold space seemed to be surrounded by thousands of invisible souls. The woman's figure appeared again. This time she stood at the top of the stairs, but when I looked up, her face was clearly visible. It was a pale face with deep, black eyes, devoid of life. Her lips moved as if she was saying something, but no sound came out. I panicked and stepped back, then slipped and fell down the stairs in my dream. When I got up, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if I had fallen from a great height. The next morning, I heard that another colleague, who had invited me to lunch a few weeks ago, had died in a small plane crash. My heart stopped. I knew for sure that this was no coincidence. David came to visit, and as soon as he saw my face, he knew something bad had happened. He began to believe me. We sat together for hours trying to figure out how to get out of this, but there was no answer except the cold silence. The following nights, I became more and more exhausted. I tried to set up a camera in my room to record my sleep, hoping to catch something. But the next morning, I looked back and saw only me turning over, drenched in sweat, no other figure. However, I clearly remember in my dreams seeing her walking towards the bed, her empty eyes staring straight at me. That cold feeling is still imprinted on my skin, even though there was absolutely no evidence. One day, David suggested I try to find a paranormal expert. We arranged to meet a woman named Martha, who was rumored to see things that others could not. When I told her story, she frowned. Her face became serious. She told me I was haunted by an entity, a ghost, or something more terrifying. Every time it appeared in my dreams, it brought a death, as if it were feeding off my fear. I asked how to get rid of it. Martha just looked at me and shook her head, saying that sometimes these entities could not be exorcised by ritual or prayer because they were not from this world. I shivered, feeling like I was condemned forever. David tried to act strong, but I saw fear in his eyes. That night, I dreamed again. I was in an abandoned church, candles flickering, walls cracked. She sat in the front row, her back to me. As I approached, she slowly turned, this time her lips moving, making a soft sound. I couldn't make out what it was, just a whisper like wind blowing through a crevice in the rocks. But I knew she was calling someone's name. When I woke up, my heart was frozen, and I immediately called David. He was still alive, but his voice was trembling. He said that during the night he had a dream in which someone was staring at him from outside the window. I began to fear for David. If this cycle was not limited to me, but also to the people I told, then he could be the next victim. I tried to convince him to keep his distance, but David insisted on not abandoning me. He said we had to find out the truth, otherwise we would both be crushed in this endless horror. The following days, I lived in a state of waiting and trembling. I knew death would come again, but I didn't know for whom, when, and under what circumstances. I started to write a detailed diary, every dream, every image, every sound, hoping that someone reading it would understand. Each page was like a last wish. On another rainy night, I fell asleep on the table. In my dream, I was in a dark hospital, the long hallway filled with footsteps. The woman appeared at the end of the hallway, holding a sign with someone's name on it. I ran towards her, but when I saw the name, I woke up, my heart pounding like it was about to jump out of my chest. The name was David. I was shocked when I saw the name clearly on the board in my dream. It was David. I woke up in a panic, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. Sweat poured down my shirt. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I immediately called David that night. My voice was shaking with fear. When he picked up the phone, hearing his normal voice, I breathed a sigh of relief, but my heart was still in turmoil. I didn't dare tell him that I had seen his name in my dream, just asked if he was okay. David smiled awkwardly, saying that he was trying to stay awake to watch over himself. But I knew deep down he was also panicking. The next day, I didn't dare take my eyes off the phone. I was afraid of any call with bad news about David. I lived in anxiety all day, unable to concentrate on anything. I wondered if I could change the outcome this time. If I had warned David in advance, would he have avoided his fate? But then another fear came, that my speaking out might bring death closer. I was in a dilemma, not knowing what to do but wait. That evening, David came to my house. He looked at me and said that we couldn't just sit and wait. He suggested that we go somewhere else, leave the city for a few days to see if things would change. The idea of leaving seemed reasonable, but deep down I knew that the ghost was not limited by space or time. It existed in dreams, where we had no way to escape. At night, I tried to stay awake, but my eyes were heavy. In my daze, I found myself back in the hospital corridor, but this time there were no footsteps, no wind, just a silence so heavy that I could hear my heart beating. The woman appeared right in front of me, so close that I could feel the coldness of her body. The name David was still on the board, but the letters were now smeared with red blood, dripping onto the tile floor. I screamed in my dream and jumped up. David sat right next to my bed, looking at me worriedly. He said I had just screamed his name. The next morning, David decided that we should drive to the countryside, somewhere remote and quiet. He hoped that getting away from familiar places might break the cycle. I reluctantly agreed. We drove for hours. The road was empty. The landscape on both sides became desolate. Finally, we found an old wooden cabin on the edge of the forest. There was no electricity, just oil lamps and a fire in the fireplace. The air was damp. The smell of rotting wood and cold earth made me shiver. The first night in the cabin, I tried to stay awake, but sleep came quickly. In my dream, I saw the cabin dark and the woman standing outside the window. She pressed her face against the glass, her dark eyes staring straight at me. I screamed in my dream, but couldn't make a sound. She raised her hand and pointed inside the cabin, right where David was sleeping. I panicked and tried to move to wake up. When I opened my eyes, I saw the window was misted with steam, as if someone had just breathed close to it. I rushed over, but outside there was only thick darkness and the sound of wind whistling through the trees. The next day, David became silent. He said that last night he had also had a dream in which he saw me standing next to his bed, my face pale, my eyes empty. I was stunned, not knowing how to explain. It was clear that the entity was playing with us, gradually erasing the boundary between me and it in David's dream that night. It rained heavily, the rain pounding on the roof of the cabin. The fire in the fireplace flickered, casting long shadows on the wall. I didn't dare close my eyes, but eventually I fell asleep. In my dream, I saw myself standing in the middle of a pitch-black forest. The woman stood a few steps away from me. Behind David was tied tightly to a tree trunk. His mouth was covered, his eyes were panicked and calling for help. I rushed over, but my body was frozen. The woman turned to look at me, then held up a shiny knife. I screamed in vain, then woke up. The rain was still pouring down, but I heard strange noises. I ran to the next room, saw David gasping for breath, cold sweat running down his forehead. He said he had just dreamed that he was tied to a tree, and I stood there watching without saving him. The two dreams were completely identical. We both knew that this was beyond endurance. It was not just a nightmare, but a reality that was slowly clinging to us every hour. I began to feel that the cabin was haunted, as if wherever we were, the entity would follow. I heard footsteps on the roof, a soft knock on the door in the middle of the night. But when I opened it, there was only darkness. The feeling of being watched was getting stronger. I didn't dare leave David's side, afraid that if I turned away, he would disappear the third night in the cabin. As I was falling asleep, I found the room had suddenly turned into a morgue. Cold drawers were stacked, one of them ajar. The woman stood right next to me, her hand grabbing the drawer door, pulling it open to reveal David's pale face inside. I screamed so loudly that I woke myself up. David woke up with a start, asking what happened. I didn't dare tell, just shook my head. The cabin, nestled in the woods, was supposed to be a place of peace. But after a few nights, it became a trap that held us both in terror. There was no electricity, only the flickering fire in the fireplace, casting every corner of the room in darkness. Outside, the rain and wind continued to pour down. The sound of the rain pounding on the roof of the cabin as a reminder that we were under siege. Every night, the fear became heavier, and sleep was like a death sentence, waiting. On the fourth night, as I drifted off to sleep, the dream dragged me down to the familiar abyss. I stood in the same cabin, but everything was more rotten. The wooden walls were cracked, the roof was leaking, and at the end of the room the woman appeared. This time, she did not just stand there silently, but slowly walked towards me. The sound of the wooden floorboards echoed, each step making me shiver. Those dark eyes like a deep abyss stared at me, then suddenly turned to David, sleeping on the bed. I tried to shout to warn, but my voice was stuck in my throat. When I woke up, I saw David still sleeping soundly, but his face was purple as if he had just had a nightmare. The next morning, David told me that he had dreamed of being strangled by a dark figure standing right above him. I was stunned because his dream matched what I had seen. The entity was now not only present in my dream, but also in David's. It was getting stronger, closer, and more dangerous. We discussed leaving the cabin that day, but the car wouldn't start. I clearly remembered checking the car before going to bed, and it was completely normal. But this morning, the battery died. The engine was silent. There was no other choice. We were stuck in the middle of the deep forest, completely isolated. I felt like an invisible hand had locked us here, preventing us from escaping. The next night, my dream took me to a dark forest. I walked on between the tall trees, the moonlight shining through the leaves. Ahead, David was being dragged by an invisible force, his mouth screaming, but no sound came out. I ran after him, but the more I ran, the further the distance became. The woman appeared in the middle of the forest, her hair covering her face. She raised her white hand and pointed straight at David. Then darkness swallowed everything. I jumped up, gasping, looked over and saw David also woke up. His eyes panicked. He said he dreamed that he was dragged into the forest and could not return. Each dream seemed to be synchronized. The two of us shared the same nightmare. That was what terrified me the most. If before I could still believe that everything was just a product of my mind, now that David was experiencing it, it was clearly no longer a simple dream. This was the truth, a terrible truth that both of us were bound to. I began to notice many strange signs in the cabin. During the day, objects moved from place to place without either of us touching them. There were light knocks from the ceiling, and sometimes a whisper like wind passing through cracks in the wood, but clear enough for me to make out the syllables. Once, I heard my name echo in the empty room. I shivered, but when I asked David, he confirmed that he had heard the same thing. That night, the storm came again. In my fitful sleep, I saw the cabin transformed into a crypt. Candles burned on coffins lined up along the wall. One of the coffins was open, and David lay inside, eyes wide open, mouth agape. The woman stood beside him, her hand on his chest like a seal. I rushed to push the coffin lid, but it was hopeless. I woke up with a choked scream, my whole body drenched in sweat. Looking at David, I saw him sitting up, panting, panicked. He said he had dreamed that he was locked in a dark box, unable to escape. Everything became clearer. The entity was trying to take David. It wasn't just about killing strangers anymore. This time, it had chosen him. I wondered why. Why, after so many random deaths, had it now focused on the only friend I had left? Was it because he knew the truth, had intervened in my destiny, that he was the target? In desperation, I suggested we try staying up all night to stop dreaming. We sat together, telling stories, drinking coffee, watching the fire burn in the fireplace. But by 3 a.m, our eyes were heavy, and no matter how hard we tried, we fell asleep. When we woke, the sun had risen, and we both vaguely remembered seeing the same dream. A door opened, a red light flooded in, and the woman stood there waiting. I knew we were approaching the final frontier. This cabin was no longer a shelter. but a launching pad to lead us both into the abyss. I was starting to feel myself losing control, not knowing how much longer I could last before this vortex swallowed me up. And the scariest thing was, I was starting to feel that the next time I woke up, there might be only one survivor. The cabin became more of a prison than a refuge. Each night, David and I were exhausted, both physically and emotionally. We sat by the fire for hours, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the door, listening to the rain pound on the roof, and watching the shadows dance on the walls. But the silence never lasted long. Sometimes we heard a knock on the door, 3 soft knocks in the middle of the night, and when we went outside to investigate, only to find nothing but total darkness. Another time, David claimed he heard someone walking slowly around the cabin, but I could see nothing but an eerie void. The dreams became more consistent. Every night, I found myself in a dank, cold scene, either the cemetery, the hospital, or the cabin itself, but more desolate. The woman was always there, never changing, with her long hair covering her face, her eyes dark, and her hands cold. Every time she pointed at David, I knew death was near. But this time, it was even more terrifying, because David also began to recount the same details. We both saw the same dream, experienced the same horror, as if we were sharing a cursed mind. One night, I woke up in the middle of a sleep. The cabin was dark, except for the dying fire. I looked over and saw David still sleeping. But in the corner of the room, I vaguely saw the figure of a woman squatting, her hands on the ground, her long hair covering her face. She didn't move, just sat still, but her soft breathing echoed in the quiet room. I stood there, my heart pounding like it was about to jump out of my chest. When I blinked again, the corner of the room was empty. I told myself I might be hallucinating, but I knew clearly that I had seen it. The next day, David admitted he had seen the same figure, but at the window. He said there was a pale face pressed against the glass, looking in. But when we ran out to check, there was nothing but a steady rain. We understood that it was not just in our dreams. The entity was slowly invading reality. And when this happened, nowhere was safe anymore. The next night, I dreamed that I was locked in a cabin, the 4 walls gradually closing in, the air was suffocating. The woman crawled on all 4s on the ceiling, moving quickly like a beast. I screamed in my dream, but my voice only echoed like an echo in the deep pit. When I woke up, I saw David screaming too, drenched in sweat. He said he saw me being dragged to the floor, and the woman crawling around as if to swallow us. A feeling of despair filled us. We discussed leaving the cabin through the woods, even though the car could not move. But the woods were dark. Wild animals and rain made every step dangerous. But I thought staying there was 1,000 times more frightening. David agreed, and we began to prepare. But as soon as we opened the cabin door, a cold wind rushed in, accompanied by a whisper. The door slammed shut behind us. We both looked at each other, knowing that we were not allowed to leave. That night, I fell asleep sitting back in my chair. My dream took me to a room full of mirrors. Dozens of mirrors reflected my face, but in each one, standing next to me, was that woman. She appeared not just once, but dozens of times, surrounding me from all sides. When I turned around, she was standing right behind me, her cold hand touching my shoulder. I woke up with a start, screaming. David also jumped up at the same time, trembling, saying that in his dream he saw me transformed into her. Her empty eyes staring at him that terrified me more than anything. Was that entity trying to possess me? turning me into a tool to kill David. I didn't dare sleep anymore, but the fatigue weighed so heavily that I couldn't resist for long. Every time I dozed off, I was afraid that when I woke up, David would be gone the next day. We tried making the sign of the cross, hanging amulets, saying prayers. But the cabin was still cold. The noises still echoed, and the dream continued. At night, I saw David standing outside in the woods, his face stiff, his eyes lifeless. I rushed out to pull him back, but when I touched him, his body dissolved into black smoke. The woman appeared, standing right behind, smiling for the first time. That smile was more terrifying than any scream. I woke up, my hands still shaking. Looking over, David was huddled in the corner of the room, saying that he had also seen me disappear before his eyes in his dream. We no longer knew what was real and what was imaginary. This cabin had turned into a prison of the mind, where every door led to darkness. And I understand that the coming days can only get worse. The cabin was no longer a shelter, but a box filled with darkness and eerie whispers. David and I were both devastated, not knowing if we were awake or asleep. There were times when I looked around, saw the woman's silhouette lurking in a corner of the room, but when I blinked again, there was only emptiness. I pinched my hand until it bled to make sure I was awake, but the haunting did not go away. One afternoon, when the rain had just stopped, we decided to step outside. The air was damp. The smell of rotting leaves was strong. The forest was strangely quiet. No birdsong, no wind. Only the sound of dry leaves rustling underfoot. David said we needed to try to find our way to the highway, but after only a few dozen meters, we both felt like we were spinning in a maze. No matter which direction we went, when we turned back, the cabin was right in front of us. I panicked, realizing we were trapped. The forest was no longer a real forest, but had become part of a nightmare that night. I dreamed that I was being dragged into a deep hole in the middle of the forest. The earth and rocks collapsed, and darkness swallowed me. In the hole, I saw countless pale hands reaching out, pulling my body. Between those hands, the woman's face appeared. A terrifying smile spread across her lifeless face. I screamed loudly in my dream, then jumped up. David was shaking me awake, his face pale. He said he dreamed that I was buried alive, the earth covering my mouth, making me suffocate. Once again, our dreams coincided eerily. The next morning, the cabin was filled with a heavy, musty smell. I saw new scratches on the wooden table, as if someone had used a fingernail to scratch them. Those scratches joined together to form letters. When I looked closely, I saw the letter D, then A, then V. I didn't need to look any further to know that the next letter would be I and D. My hands were shaking. I brushed everything off the floor, but the scratches were still deep, impossible to erase. David began to lose control. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. His eyes were dark and his body was shaking. He said he kept hearing his name called in the night, as if someone was whispering right in his ear. I knew that the entity had chosen him, and it was only a matter of time before it took his life. That night, I dreamed of a cabin covered in blood. The walls, the floor, and even the ceiling were all red. David lay motionless in the middle of the room, and the woman knelt beside him, her hand deep in his chest. When she pulled her hand out, she had a bloody heart still beating. I woke up with a heart-wrenching scream, tears streaming down my face. David was also startled, clutching his chest, saying he saw someone stab him in the chest. I had no doubt. This curse no longer claimed only strangers. It wanted David, and I had no idea how to stop it. I begged him to leave the cabin, but he shook his head. He believed that running away would not work. He said that perhaps the only solution was to confront it directly, to find a way to talk to the entity. I was terrified, but he was determined. We spent the day preparing. David wrote his own diary in case he was gone. I gathered my courage, placed oil lamps around the cabin, lit every corner. We sat in the middle of the room, holding hands, waiting for the darkness to come. The wind howled outside. The rain poured down again. And as expected, when the clock struck midnight, the room was cold. The fire in the fireplace died down. The woman appeared, not in a dream, but right before my eyes. She stood in the middle of the room, her long hair hanging down, water dripping onto the floor. Her deep eyes looked straight at David. He trembled but did not pull his hand away from me. He asked her aloud what she wanted. The room shook, the wind howled, but there was no answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her white hand extended toward him. I screamed, pulling David back, but his body seemed to be sucked forward. In that moment, I understood that the curse had spiraled out of control. The entity was no longer confined to dreams. It had entered the real world, and we had nowhere to hide. The moment the woman entered the cabin, I knew we had crossed the final line. It was no longer just a nightmare, her presence now as clear and heavy as the air. The oil lamp flickered, the flame almost extinguished, and the cold that filled the room made me shiver. David tried to keep calm, but I could feel his hand squeezing mine, shaking violently. She took a step forward, each step making a horrible creaking sound on the rotten wooden floor. I shouted for David to run, but he seemed mesmerized, his eyes fixed on the ghost. I yanked him back, and we both fell to the floor. When I looked up, she was right in front of me, so close that I could see drops of water dripping from the long hair that covered her face. Then her dark eyes peeked out from behind her hair, boring into us. I felt like I was being sucked into a bottomless pit. In a panic, I grabbed a nearby candle and threw it at her. The flickering flame illuminated her pale face, and for a moment I saw a creepy half smile. Then the light went out, and the room was plunged into darkness. David screamed, pulling me up. We rushed towards the main door, but it seemed to be locked from the outside. I pounded on the door, screaming in despair. Behind me, footsteps were still slowly approaching. When I turned around, she was gone. The silence was suffocating. David and I pressed our backs against the door, our hearts pounding like drums. I tried to reassure myself that we might be hallucinating, but the cold and dampness on the floor proved her presence real. We huddled together all night, not daring to close our eyes. But fatigue gradually swallowed our will, and we finally fell asleep in my dream. I saw the cabin disappear, replaced by a dilapidated old house. The walls were peeling, the windows were broken, and the smell of mold was heavy. The woman stood in the middle of the house, holding an old mirror. When she held it up, I saw not my image, but David. He lay motionless, blood flowing from his mouth. I screamed and grabbed the mirror, but the glass shattered into thousands of pieces. Each piece reflected a ghostly, smiling face. I woke up screaming. David also jumped up, his face pale. He said he dreamed that I was trying to kill him with a piece of mirror. We were silent, neither of us daring to say more. It was clear that the entity was playing a game with us, sowing doubt to separate us. I looked at David, seeing a flash of fear in his eyes. I didn't know if it was for the ghost or for me. The next day, the cabin was still quiet. But we no longer felt like this place was ours. Every object, every piece of wood seemed to be watching, witnessing our every move. I discovered more scratches on the wall, this time in the shape of a hand. 5 long fingers stretched down to the floor, as if someone had left a mark. I didn't tell David, just quietly covered it up, but I knew the cabin was haunted at night. I fell asleep in a state of half awake. I heard someone calling my name. When I opened my eyes, I saw David sitting motionless in the middle of the room, eyes wide open, staring into space. I shook him, but he didn't respond. Then a whisper came from his mouth, but it wasn't his voice. The voice was cold, hoarse, repeating the same sentence, "He's mine." I was horrified and let go of his hand. David fell down, gasping for breath. When he woke up, he didn't remember anything. I realized we weren't just being hunted, but David was being gradually possessed. The ghost no longer wanted to kill him immediately. It wanted to hold him, to make him its possession. And I, the witness, was forced to watch helplessly as it all happened. We decided to try leaving the cabin again, taking the few things we needed and walking through the woods. But after hours, we still returned to the same place. The cabin appeared before us, dark as if it had never been. I screamed in despair, and David fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. We understood. We had not chosen the cabin, it had chosen us. That night, when the storm came, I clearly saw in my dream that the cabin was not just an abandoned house. It was a giant tomb containing the spirit of that woman. And now it was about to swallow us both. The cabin was no longer a shelter, but a giant wooden coffin closing in around us. The air was so heavy that I could hardly breathe, each breath smelling of mold and decay. David sat against the wall, his eyes staring blankly, his face gaunt, his lips dry and cracked. I knew he could not bear it any longer. Every night we dreamed together, lived in the same terror as an endless repetition. But the nightmare did not stop at dreams. It had crept into every corner of reality. I heard footsteps on the roof every night. At first I thought it was wild animals, but the footsteps were steady, slow, as if someone was deliberately circling around to torment us. Another time, I saw a faint silhouette on the wall, the figure of a long-haired woman, but when I brought the oil lamp closer, it disappeared. David said he saw a face pressed against the window, empty black eyes staring inside. We both knew that this cabin was not only haunted, but it was her very embodiment. That night, I fell into an unwilling sleep. In my dream, I saw a white, hospital-like room, brightly lit. But in the midst of that brightness was David lying on the hospital bed. 4 tubes were inserted into his arms, but the blood in the tubes did not flow, but froze into black. The woman stood in the corner of the room, no longer covering her face. Her face was pale, her mouth stretched to her ears, her eyes were deep and bottomless. I saw her whisper something in David's ear. He struggled, his mouth wide open as if trying to scream, but no sound came out. I rushed forward, but my feet were glued to the floor. When I woke up, I saw David also clutching his chest, gasping for breath, his eyes wide open. He said he dreamed he was in the hospital, and I stood there watching him die. I began to doubt whether we could still distinguish between reality and dream. This cabin had swallowed the boundary. Even during the day, I heard whispers calling my name. Once, when I bent down to get water in the dry well behind the cabin, I saw my reflection in an unusual way. Instead of a tired face, I saw hollow black eyes and long, flowing hair. I backed away, my heart pounding, and almost fell into the well. I didn't dare tell David, afraid he would collapse completely. More and more signs appeared. New scratches on the floor, scribbles on the windows in steam. Once, when I woke in the middle of the night, I saw a wet handprint on David's chest, as if someone had just touched it. He didn't know anything, just breathing evenly in his sleep. I sat up all night, but I could do nothing but watch the darkness swallow the cabin. We tried the exorcism rituals Martha had given us in an old book. We burned incense, placed salt around the room, and said prayers. But everything only made the cabin shake more violently. The fire went out, the wind howled through the cracks in the door, and I could hear the sound of women's laughter echoing everywhere. David knelt in fear, and I knew that all my efforts were in vain. This was no ordinary ghost. This was an entity that fed on fear and death, something that could not be easily driven away. The next night, I dreamed that I was standing in front of a row of stacked coffins. Each coffin had the name of a person I knew, someone I had dreamed of before they died. I walked past each one until I stopped in front of a new coffin. The name engraved on it was David. I tried to open the lid, but it was empty. Then from the darkness, the woman appeared and pushed me into the coffin. I screamed and struggled, but the lid slammed shut. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the cabin, shaking all over, and David held me, saying that I had been screaming his name in my dreams. We knew it was near. The cabin was no longer a mere shelter. It had become a trap, a living tomb, and the woman, with her deep black eyes, was waiting for the last moment to claim David's soul. In the days that followed, I could no longer tell what was real and what was a dream. The cabin was filled with a thick, heavy fog that made breathing difficult. The sunlight could not dispel the darkness inside. I began to see strange images even when I was awake. Sometimes I looked out the window and saw a woman standing in the middle of the forest, motionless as a stone statue. But when I blinked, she disappeared, leaving only a cold void. David also confessed that he saw handprints on the glass door, wet as if someone had touched it from outside. One afternoon, when the rain had just stopped, we heard footsteps on the porch. David rushed out, but there was no one outside. Instead, on the wet ground were imprinted small, slender footprints, leading straight to the cabin door and then disappearing. I shivered, feeling as if the woman had really stepped into the real world, leaving a tangible trace that nothing could deny. That night, I dreamed that I was sitting in a cabin, but all the objects were hanging upside down from the ceiling. The tables, chairs, oil lamps, even David himself were upside down, his eyes wide open, staring down at me. The woman stood in the middle, her hair hanging down, a wide smile on her face. I tried to scream, but the sound turned into a creepy whisper echoing back. When I woke up, I saw David also jumped up at the same time, drenched in sweat. He said he dreamed that I was crawling on the cabin ceiling like a spider, my empty black eyes staring down at him. We both understood that the entity not only wanted to take David's life, but also wanted to turn us against each other. The cabin became a prison, and the nightmare became an invisible person's game. The next morning, when David opened the notebook where he wrote his diary, we discovered new lines of writing. Not his, nor mine. The scribbled words written in blotchy black ink read, "Tomorrow is your turn." We looked at each other, speechless. My heart was pounding, and David held his head, almost screaming in fear. The afternoon fell, and the sky darkened faster than usual. Strange noises echoed throughout the cabin, from a steady knocking on the wall to a claw-like scratching on the floor. David and I huddled together by the fire, but the fire kept weakening, as if extinguished by an invisible wind. Then from the corner of the room, the woman's figure gradually appeared, no longer as vague as before. She walked out, each step leaving a watermark on the floor. I squeezed David's hand. My heart stopped beating. She stopped in front of us, then bent down to look straight at David. In that moment, I clearly saw her pale face, her lips chapped as if dried blood. She opened her mouth slightly, letting out a cold whisper, "It's time." Then the figure dissipated into thin smoke, blending into the air. David trembled, collapsed to the floor, his eyes blank. I knew that time was running out. All we could do was wait in terror, each night a step closer to death. This cabin was no longer just a shelter. It had become a portal between life and death. And we, the two unfortunates, were the prey that had been lured into the trap. The dreams began to change. They no longer lasted for hours in a sense of eternity, but became short and fleeting. But each time I fell asleep, those brief fragments of images were more intense and haunting than ever. It was as if the entity no longer needed much time to instill fear. Just a flash of a dream was enough to burn itself into our minds. The first night of that short series of dreams, I saw her empty black eyes as soon as I closed my eyes. No context, no sound, just those eyes fixed on me. When I opened my eyes, I could still feel them staring through the cabin ceiling. David trembled too, saying he saw a face pressed against him as he fell asleep. We both knew the dream didn't need to be long anymore. It had seeped into our blood and souls the next day. The air in the cabin was so thick that I felt like I was living in a dream even when I was awake. I heard a soft laugh from somewhere, but David didn't hear it. Then, a few minutes later, he said he heard crying. While I didn't, the cabin seemed to be playing a game with each of us, isolating our fears to torture us both. That night, as the rain poured down outside, I dreamed I was standing in a white room. David stood a few meters away from me, but every time I stepped closer, the distance between us stretched endlessly. The woman stood in the middle, her eyes boring into me, then turned to David. She raised her hand, and David vanished like dust. I jumped up, gasping, and David held his head, saying he dreamed I was watching him disappear without saving him. The dreams overlapped, short but fierce. Another night, I dreamed only of a pale hand reaching out from the darkness, grabbing my neck. The feeling of suffocation was still clear when I opened my eyes. David dreamed of the cabin in flames, and the woman standing in the middle of the flames, unburned, still smiling. He woke up with the smell of smoke on his clothes. Even though the cabin was not on fire, we could no longer tell if we were awake or dreaming. Every time we closed our eyes, a brief vision would come to us. During the day, we tried to find a way out, but every path led us back to the cabin. It was as if we had long since died, our souls trapped in this invisible trap. David gradually became unstable. He began to whisper to himself, repeating the phrase that everything was about to end. I asked him what he heard, and he said there was a woman's voice in his head, whispering incessantly. I knew she was slowly taking over his mind. The next night, I dreamed of David sitting motionless in a chair, his eyes lifeless, while the woman behind him put her hand on his shoulder. I rushed to pull him away, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. When I woke up, David was sitting in the same position, motionless, staring into space. I shook him, and finally he blinked, panicked as if he had just woken up from a dream. The cabin was rotting more and more. Planks were falling off, revealing a pitch-black interior like empty eye sockets. Scratching sounds echoed throughout the night, sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the floor. I began to feel like the cabin wasn't a house, but the body of the entity itself, and we were trapped inside it. On the third night of my short dream series, I saw only one scene. A coffin in the middle of the room, with David's name engraved on it. I stood there, unable to move. The lid of the coffin was slightly opened, and a white woman's hand slowly emerged. I woke up with a start, and David screamed in his dream. He said he felt trapped in a dark box, heard me calling but never came to save him. I knew the end was near. The shorter the dream, the closer the truth came. And this cabin, which used to be our shelter, is now just a closed prison, waiting to take us to the depths of death. The cabin was not only haunted by the presence of ghosts, but also changed in an inexplicable way. Strange phenomena began to occur even when we were completely awake. One evening, as I sat writing in my diary, the pen in my hand suddenly flew out and rolled onto the floor. David saw it with his own eyes. His face paled, and I was stunned. Immediately after, the books on the shelf fell down with a crash, as if someone had pushed them. We rushed to pick them up, but when we put them back together, the pages were all torn to shreds, as if they had been scratched by claws. At night, the sounds were even more terrifying. Once, David and I heard the sound of chairs and tables being pulled in the next room. When we ran over, everything was intact, without a trace. But on the floor appeared a line of scribbled words, as if hastily carved. "There is no way out." I felt my blood run cold. And David muttered that the cabin was talking to us. In the next dream, I found myself suspended in mid-air in this very cabin. The tables, chairs, and objects around me were flying around, spinning like in an invisible tornado. The woman appeared in the middle, unaffected. She raised her hand, signaling those objects to rush towards me. When I woke up, I saw some real objects falling on the floor. And David said that in his dream, he also saw the cabin flying around. We began to realize that what happened in the dream was not just a dream. It had affected the real world. Scratches, moving objects, even strange lines, all proved that the cabin was a point of intersection between two worlds. The other entity was using this place as a door to step out completely. Another time, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I saw David standing motionless in the middle of the room, his eyes wide open. I called out to him, but he did not answer. When I got closer, I saw his lips moving, emitting whispers in a strange language. The voice was hoarse, not David's. I shook him hard, and he finally collapsed, gasping for breath. When he woke up, he didn't remember anything, only a sore throat. I knew clearly that his body had been borrowed by something. The next day, the cabin became heavier. Each wooden board made a groaning sound like a cry. I heard a steady knocking sound from the floor, as if someone was trapped underneath. David and I tried to lift the board, but there was only a dark, damp area underneath. However, the stench rose up, making us nauseous. We immediately closed it, but the knocking sound continued. Lasting until morning, the next night, I dreamed that I was drowning in a room filled with water. The cabin was flooded, and I struggled desperately. David floated right next to me, his eyes empty, his mouth open to let the thick black water flow in. The woman floated above, her hair flowing like a river, laughing silently. I jumped up, coughing. But the terrible thing was that David woke up too, coughing violently as if he had just drowned. His clothes were soaked, even though the cabin was completely dry. I understood that the boundary had completely disappeared. The cabin was the door, and we were just puppets controlled in this horror game. David was getting weaker, his body shaking, his voice hoarse, sometimes mumbling nonsense. I knew time was running out, but I had no way to save him. When night fell again, I prayed that I would not sleep. But in the end, fatigue still overcame me. And this time the dream began with the image of the cabin in complete darkness. The woman stood at the door, and behind her were thousands of other black figures, all staring at me. I understood that there was not just one entity, but the cabin was a tomb containing countless souls. And now, David was the next to be devoured. The cabin became distorted like a living painting, where darkness not only covered but twisted every shape. I looked around and saw that the shadows on the wall no longer matched my real body. When I raised my hand, my shadow stretched 3 times longer, my fingers curled like claws. David saw it too, and his eyes were filled with panic. He said the cabin was no longer a physical place, but like a living painting, a horror scene we were trapped in at night. Things became even more bizarre. Objects began to move in irrational ways. Chairs rocked as if someone was sitting on them. Tables swayed. The fire in the fireplace painted cartoon-like images on the walls. I clearly saw the woman's face appear in the flames, her mouth smiling widely, then disappearing in a puff of smoke. David gripped my shoulder, trembling, telling me that we had fallen into a distorted reality, where nightmares turned into vivid images. In a short dream, I saw myself transformed into a cartoon character. My body was limp, my head was twisted, my limbs were abnormally long. I ran in the cabin, but the floor stretched endlessly. The woman appeared in front of me, also distorted like a painting. Her eyes were empty but bright. She stretched out her endless arms to touch me. And at that moment, I was startled awake, feeling like my whole body was distorted. David said he dreamed that I was no longer myself, but a distorted mannequin crawling towards him. The distortion was not only in dreams. During the day, we saw the cabin door warped like rubber. The table and chairs were elastic. Even the light from outside flickered like the frames of an old movie. Every time I blinked, I saw the cabin like a twisted cartoon scene. This drove us crazy, because we did not know what was real and what was the product of that force. David was increasingly exhausted. He said he heard laughter coming from the walls. I put my ear to it, and sure enough, a faint sound like a child's laughter echoed through the wood. It spread throughout the cabin, sometimes loud, sometimes soft, sometimes near, sometimes far, keeping us both awake. The next night, I dreamed that the cabin had become a stage. David and I stood in the middle, the woman sitting in the audience. On the wall were projected scenes of the deaths of all the people I had dreamed of before. Each death was replayed like a short film, distorted and haunting. When David's scene came, I saw him screaming on the screen, while in real life he stood next to me, eyes wide open, staring at himself. I cried, screamed, but it was all just a terrible play from which we could not escape. When I woke up, the real cabin was exactly the same. The walls were covered with scribbles, the image of the woman repeated everywhere, as if someone had been drawing it for years. David said the cabin had turned into a living movie, and we were just characters in it. I began to understand that the entity didn't just want to kill David. It wanted to turn both of us into part of this endless story, like cartoon characters that never left the screen. And the cabin was the giant frame, swallowing everything that night. I didn't dare to sleep. but eventually I fell asleep. I saw myself and David turn into black shadows, running round the cabin, while the woman sat on the ceiling, clapping and laughing. That laugh echoed like a crack in my head. When I woke up, my body felt cold, my hands were shaking, and in my head echoed only one thought: we were no longer real people. The cabin became increasingly cramped, not only in space, but also because of the terrible loneliness that weighed on it. David and I no longer talked much. In the early days, we tried to reassure each other with a few hesitant words, but now silence prevailed. Each of us sat in a corner, staring at the weak fire, just to make sure we still existed. The feeling of home alone had never been so clear, even though we were still sitting next to each other one night. When I woke up from a coma, I realized that David was no longer in the room. My heart sank. I rushed to look for him. The cabin was dark, only moonlight coming in through the window. I found David standing motionless on the porch, staring into the darkness of the forest. I called out, but he did not turn around. When I put my hand on his shoulder, his body was cold, stiff as a statue. I shook him hard, and finally he blinked. He said he heard someone calling his name, telling him to come out. I looked around, but the forest was absolutely silent. We returned to the cabin, but from then on, I knew clearly that the ghost was pulling David away from me little by little. In the following days, David became strange. He spoke little, his eyes were lifeless. Sometimes he sat for hours staring into space. I asked him what he thought. He only answered curtly that the cabin had chosen us. I trembled, because that sentence did not sound like his voice, but like a woman's whisper. At night, I began to hear footsteps around the cabin more often. It was repetitive, regular, as if someone was patrolling. I no longer dared to open the door, just pressed my ear to the wood and clearly heard the whisper right on the other side of the door. Once, I heard my own voice calling David's name from the forest. I panicked, turned around, and saw that David had stood up, preparing to step out. I rushed to pull him back, shouting loudly that it was not me. He looked at me, his eyes glistening with tears, saying that he could no longer distinguish what was real. That night, the cabin was pitch black because the oil lamps had run out. We only had a faint light from the moon. When I fell asleep, I found myself completely alone in the cabin. There was no David, no sound of wind, only absolute silence. The woman stood in the middle of the room, her long hair hanging down, her two hands reaching out as if to hug me. I screamed, ran to the door, but when I opened it, there was only nothingness outside. An endless blackness swallowed everything. I woke up, cold sweat pouring out, and saw David sitting in the corner of the room, looking at me with a strange gaze. The next day, I tried to ask David if he had seen me in his dream. He nodded, saying that he had dreamed that I left the cabin, leaving him alone. He said that the feeling of being home, alone in the dream was so terrible that he wanted to die to escape it. I choked up, not daring to tell him that I had experienced the same thing myself. The cabin became a place that imprisoned us in solitude. Even though there were two of us, each of us was separated in our own nightmare world. The ghost did not need to kill us immediately. It only needed to sow loneliness, to make the soul gradually disintegrate. And I knew, if it continued like this, both David and I would be crushed, without a hand to touch. The next night, I saw David sitting in the dark, whispering incoherent sentences. I approached him and he turned back, his eyes black as if they had no pupils. He smiled, a smile I had never seen on my friend's face. He said in a hoarse voice, She chose me. I stepped back, my heart pounding, and David slowly stood up, walking slowly. I knew clearly that from that moment, I was truly alone. The rain began to fall in torrents that night. The drops of water pounded against the roof of the wooden cabin, creating a familiar sound that should have brought peace. But to David and me, the rain sounds now sounded like 1,000 whispers surrounding us. Each raindrop hitting the roof echoed in my ears like a name. I tried to cover my ears, but the more I did, the louder the sound became, seeping into my brain. David sat motionless for hours, staring out the window. I asked him what he was looking at, and he replied that he saw faces in the streaks of water running down the glass. I moved closer, looked closely, and sure enough, the drops of water formed shapes that resembled faces, smiling. I shuddered and backed away, but David did not take his eyes off, as if hypnotized. That night, I dreamed that the cabin was submerged in water. The rain did not just fall outside, but flooded inside, drowning David and me. In the dark water, the woman floated, her hair spread out like seaweed. She approached, her eyes vacant as she looked at me, then pulled David down. I tried to swim after her, but my hands were held tight by other cold hands. When I woke up, I saw David lying on the floor, his clothes soaked as if he had just been soaked in the rain. But the cabin was completely dry. The next day, the rain had not stopped. The space was damp and cold. I heard the murmur of each drop of water falling through the cracks in the roof. The sound combined into fragmented words, like stay and belong. I knew clearly it was no longer an illusion. The rain had also become a tool of that force. David was increasingly exhausted. He said he could no longer hear the normal sound of rain, but screams. He held his head, screaming in despair, telling me that hundreds of voices were ringing in his head at the same time. I tried to calm myself down, but I knew that the cabin was using nature to destroy us from within. At night, when I laid my head on the table in exhaustion, I heard the rain outside turn into a strange melody. It was like a lullaby, gentle but distorted, made up of thousands of drops of water. In my dream, I saw myself standing outside in the woods, the rain hitting my face cold. The woman stood a few steps away from me, her mouth moving to sing along with the rain. David knelt right in front of her, his eyes lifeless, his mouth mumbling along. I rushed to pull him up, but his feet were stuck in the mud, unable to move. I woke up screaming, and David sat trembling, holding his head. He said his dream was the same, but in it, I was standing next to the woman, singing along with the rain song. He looked at me with fear, as if I too had been possessed by a part of my soul. The rain lasted for 3 days straight, without a break. The cabin was heavily damp. The wooden walls were soaked with water. The cracks were like blood vessels. We heard the steady drip from the roof, but each drop made a sound like laughter. No one dared to sleep, but eventually fatigue caught up with us. In the next dream, I saw David standing in the middle of a heavy rainstorm, water pouring down on him. The woman stood right behind him, her hand on his shoulder. I screamed, but the rain drowned it out. When I ran back, we both disappeared into the rain. I woke up, looking around in panic. David lay motionless on the floor, his skin cold. I had to shake him for a long time before he opened his eyes, his lips trembling as he said one single sentence: "She will take me with the rain." I sat there for hours, the sound of the rain still ringing in my ears, but now I heard laughter mixed in. The cabin had become a sound trap, where even the sound of rain was a sign of approaching death. The cabin had turned into a living creepypasta, where every detail seemed pre-written to instill fear. I sat in the dark, the light from the weak fire reflected off the walls. There were scribbles I had never seen before. David pointed to them and said with a trembling voice that they changed every hour. When I looked closely, they formed short stories, each describing a different death. Some were identical to people I knew, deaths that had actually happened. There were others about me and David, but not yet. I felt like this cabin was not just holding us, it was writing a story about us. Every night, new characters appeared, as if someone was typing each line in blood. David said the cabin wanted to turn us into characters, like the horror legends that spread on the internet. But this was not just a rumor. This was the truth that was happening in my dream. I found myself sitting in front of an old computer screen, the screen lit up, displaying the very story I was living. The words flashed. He will die at dawn. She will take his friend's soul. I tried to erase them, but the keyboard didn't respond. The screen just glowed, and then the woman's face appeared, her eyes blank, her mouth stretched into a smile that stretched from ear to ear. I screamed through the chair and woke up with a pounding heart. David sat up at the same time, saying he dreamed I was writing a story about us during the day. We heard a keyboard-like tapping sound echoing in the cabin. It repeated over and over, accentuating each beat, and each time the sound stopped, a new line of text appeared on the wall. One time it was clear, no one escapes the last page. I read it aloud, and David looked at me with despair. We began to argue. I wanted to find a way to destroy the cabin, burn it all down, and end it. But David believed that the cabin was more than just wood and stone. It was a living entity. Burning the cabin would be like burning ourselves. I don't know who was right. I just know that every second here, this story was getting closer to the end. That night, I fell asleep in extreme tension. In my dream, I saw the cabin turn into a giant book. David and I were trapped in the pages, trying to escape, but each step left a trail of blood behind us. The woman followed, not in a hurry, just slowly turning the pages, bringing us to the end. When I turned to look, David had disappeared. Only the words, he was taken. I woke up, screaming my friend's name. David sat right next to me, his face pale, his eyes lifeless. He said in a trembling voice that he too saw himself disappearing into a page of a book, erased like a meaningless line. He held his head and cried, while I could only sit silently, feeling as if our fate had been written long ago. The cabin shook and moved all night, as if the walls were breathing. The knocking, the laughter, the whispering all blended together, turning into a spooky song. I knew that this creepypasta was never written to have a happy ending. It was written to keep us in fear until death closed the final page. I couldn't stand the cabin anymore. The walls were closing in. The words that appeared every night made me suffocate. I pulled David out, saying that we had to try to get away from this place, at least to breathe. He hesitated. His eyes were lifeless, but finally nodded. We gathered the few remaining items, an oil lamp, some dried food, and went deep into the forest, hoping to find a place to camp for the night. The forest was filled with the sound of pouring rain. The cold air cut through the skin. We walked for hours, and when our legs were tired, we finally found a clearing in the middle of the jungle. We made a temporary tent with an old cloth and gathered some dry wood to make a fire. The small fire flickered, the weak light shining on David's face, making him look more haggard than ever. I thought, at least this place was far from the cabin. maybe we would escape the stalking. But then, when night fell, I realized I was wrong. The crackling fire made strange sounds, like a woman's whisper. David swore he saw a figure standing silently among the trees, her long wet hair hanging down to cover her face. I looked in the direction he pointed, but saw only the dense darkness. Even so, I knew in my heart that she had followed us here. That night, when I fell asleep, I found myself in a large campsite, dozens of tents arranged in a circle. But there was no one living there. Only corpses were scattered about, faces distorted, eyes wide open. In the middle of that circle, the woman stood motionless, her hands hanging down, her mouth moving as she called my name. When I woke up, the fire was almost out, and David sat trembling, saying that he too had a dream of a series of dead people around the tent. The noises in the forest grew clearer. At first it was the howling wind, then the rustling of leaves. But then the sound turned into footsteps. We looked around, the fire casting long shadows on the trees, and I could swear I saw a figure pass by. David grabbed my arm, whispering shakily, "She's here." I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. In the pitch blackness, I saw two bright spots staring straight at us. Then a soft laugh rang out, mingling with the crackling of the firewood. I wanted to run, but my legs were stiff, unable to move. David held his head, screaming, saying he heard hundreds of voices whispering his name. When the fire died down, the night swallowed me. I could clearly feel someone standing right behind me, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned around, but saw nothing. In that moment, I knew we would never escape. The cabin, the forest, even this campsite, were all under the control of the entity. I pulled David into the tent, both of us shivering, lying close together, trying to sleep. But in my dream, I was back at the cabin. The fire in the woods was an illusion, and the truth was, we had never left. When I woke up, my hands were covered in mud, and David was panting, his eyes red. He whispered that we had gone in circles, and wherever we camped, we were still sleeping in the same giant trap. I sat there, listening to the wind howl and the rustling of leaves around the tent. The sounds suddenly turned into laughter, and I knew we had never really left the cabin. We were just camping in an extended nightmare. After a failed camping night, David and I knew we were not free from the trap. The entire forest was haunted, shrouded in an invisible darkness that we could not overcome. Every path took us back to the starting point, as if the forest was rotating around the cabin. The more we tried to escape, the deeper we fell into a vicious circle. That day, the sky was gloomy, a light drizzle fell. David had no strength left. He sat down on the ground, his eyes blankly staring up at the treetops. I shook him to stand up, but his body seemed to have lost all vitality. He whispered that the cabin and the forest were not only haunted, they were alive, and we were just captive prey as night fell. We made another makeshift fire, but the weak flame did not bring any warmth. Noises echoed throughout the forest, from the wind to the sound of broken branches. But strangely, the sound had a rhythm, like footsteps walking round. I grabbed the oil lamp and shone it everywhere. The light swept through the trees, and for a moment I saw a woman's silhouette standing a few feet away, her long hair covering her face. I screamed, but when David turned to look, there was nothing there. David began to lose control. He whispered that he saw the cabin in the middle of the woods, even though we had clearly left. He described it as lit, with a woman's silhouette standing at the door, waving. I shivered, because I had also seen a flicker of light in the distance. We knew the cabin had taken us, not we had taken the cabin. In my dream, I saw a series of ghosts hovering around us. Not just the woman, but many other faces, distorted, empty. They whispered, echoing in chorus, all calling us to stay. When I woke up, I saw a series of wet handprints on the ground around the tent, as if someone had touched us while we slept. The next day, I decided to drag David along. But with each step, I felt the forest distort, the tree trunks repeated, the rocks identical. When I looked back, our footprints disappeared after only a few seconds. I understood that we were no longer walking on real land, but just spinning in the maze of a haunted force. David collapsed, sobbing, saying that he heard his mother calling his name. I knew it was just a trick, but his eyes were lost, as if he believed it absolutely. He got up, rushed into the dark forest, calling out "Mum." I ran after him, shouting his name, but only the howling wind could be heard. When I caught up, David was standing in the middle of an open space, but around him were dozens of dark shadows approaching. I pulled him to run, but those shadows disappeared as soon as we touched each other. That night, the rain poured down heavily. We huddled in the tent, shivering with cold and fear. I could clearly hear the sound of dripping water mixed with whispers close to my ear. David sat motionless, his eyes red. He said the ghost had chosen him, and I was just a witness. I squeezed his hand, saying we would escape together. But in my heart, I knew the ghost would not let us go. In my last dream of the night, I saw the cabin again. It stood tall in the middle of the forest, a red light shining from within, and the woman at the door smiled and waited. David walked towards it, and I could only scream in despair. When I woke up, I saw him still lying next to me, but his hand was cold, as if it had left his life. What we were experiencing reminded me of the stories I had read, the true stories told with trembling voices. At the time, I thought they were all just rumors to scare people. But now, every detail in the cabin, every dream, every whisper proved that nightmares could become reality. David and I were no longer listeners. We had become the main characters in a story that no one wanted to believe. David was getting weaker. He ate very little, hardly slept. His eyes were dark and his face was visibly gaunt. I tried to keep him awake by talking, but sometimes he just sat still, staring into space. He whispered that he heard others calling his name, strange but powerful voices. He said it wasn't just the woman's ghost, but many other spirits, all trapped here. I shivered, because I too had begun to hear those calls in the night. One evening, we tried to walk far away from the cabin, hoping to find a way out. It got dark faster than usual, and the forest was shrouded in a thick fog. I helped David walk, but the more I walked, the more familiar it seemed. The trees repeated, the rocks identical. Finally, when the fog cleared, we were standing in front of the cabin again. David collapsed, crying silently. I felt like we were trapped in a loop of true stories about the unfortunate who never returned. That night, I dreamed of a group of strangers sitting in the cabin, around a wooden table. They looked like travelers, like us. Each person told a story about how they came here and then disappeared. When I looked closely, each of them disappeared mid-sentence, leaving only an echo in the empty room. The woman stepped out of the darkness, continuing to piece together the disjointed stories into a single verdict. Everyone died here. When I woke up, David said, shaking, that he had dreamed of the same group of people and they had all disappeared. The next day, the cabin was filled with strange sounds. I heard a tapping sound, like a heartbeat, then a woman's sigh coming from the cracks in the wood. David said he saw new words carved into the wall. This is the true story. You are the sequel. I gritted my teeth, knowing that the cabin was recording our every moment, turning it into one of those true stories that others would shudder to hear later. But for us, it wasn't a story. It was an inescapable sentence. When night fell, the rain poured down again. I huddled next to David, listening to the rain mixed with the creepy sounds. In my dream, I saw myself telling this story to a crowd, but no one believed me. They laughed at me, saying it was just a cheap, creepy. But when I finished, one of them stood up, and I realized it was David with black eyes. He whispered that this story was real, and I would never escape. I woke with a start, tears streaming down my face. David was still lying beside me, breathing weakly. I looked at him, my heart aching. We were not just living in a nightmare, but in a real story. A story that had been written long ago, just waiting for our turn to act it out. And I knew the end was near. I began to realize the truth behind all the nightmares we had endured. The woman was more than just a wandering ghost. She carried a deep hatred, a revenge story rooted in betrayal and unjust death. This cabin was not haunted by chance. It was a tomb, a testament to the cruelty that humans had inflicted on her. And now, every soul that entered this place became a victim of that unquenchable rage. David sat huddled in the corner, his eyes lifeless, his breathing shallow. He whispered incoherent words, as if repeating someone else's. I tried to listen, and gradually realized he was telling the ghost's own story. The betrayal, the imprisonment, and finally, the painful death. David trembled, but the words still came out as if forced. I shuddered, because he never knew the details. It was clear that the spirit had entered him, using his body to tell its revenge story. In the next dream, I saw a tragic scene. The woman was tied up in the cabin. Fire was burning from all sides. Anonymous people stood outside, laughing wildly while she screamed in despair. Her eyes looked straight at me, her gaze filled with hatred. I clearly saw the image of her heart being burned, but her soul was still there, full of hatred. When I woke up, I saw the cabin was hot, as if it was burning from within. David screamed that he felt the fire in his own body. I understood that this ghost did not just want us to die. She wanted us to feel all the pain she had endured. Every dream, every loss, every death I witnessed were just chapters in this endless revenge story. And we were the ending, the sacrifice to complete the story. David was becoming less and less himself. That night, as I tried to keep him awake, he suddenly woke up, his dark eyes empty. He looked at me and laughed. A laugh that was not my friend's. His voice was hoarse, but clear, each word like a knife cutting into my heart. She wants you to see me die, like she did. I trembled, backed away, tears welling up. I begged the spirit to spare us, but the laughter echoed throughout the cabin in my dream. I saw myself forced to witness David being burned alive. The fire was raging, he was screaming my name, and the woman stood next to him, her eyes full of gloating. The scene repeated itself over and over, like a film torturing my mind. When I woke up, I saw a real burn mark on David's arm, bright red, even though we had no fire nearby. I understood that the revenge story was no longer just a dream. It had entered reality. The cabin shook all night, the wood creaking like a wail. I sat next to David, holding his hand, praying desperately. But deep down, I knew that prayer could never reach a soul consumed by hatred. The ghost did not want forgiveness. did not want rest. She wanted revenge, and we were just tools to keep that rage burning. I cried silently, realizing that the end was not in running away, but in accepting that we were just part of a story that had already been written, a revenge story that had no end, and tomorrow's dawn might never come for us. That last night, the cabin shook violently like a living thing. The wind howled through the cracks in the door. The rain lashed against the wooden roof with a terrifying sound. I held David tightly, trying to keep him awake, but his eyes were lost. His body trembled, his lips moving with words that did not belong to him. I heard a woman's voice echo through him, a cold whisper. "You will witness the death of your friend as I did." The cabin glowed red, as if on fire, but the fire did not consume the wood. It only lit up, illuminating the woman standing in the middle of the room. The ghost was taller than before, her wet hair reaching the floor, her empty eyes glowing. I backed away, but David was drawn to her. He fell to his knees, his body convulsing. I screamed, begging her to stop, but my screams echoed in the endless void. In the dream that flooded my mind, I saw David tied in the middle of the room, surrounded by flames. The woman stood right next to me, her eyes blazing with hatred. I tried to rush in, but my legs were held tight by thousands of ghostly hands. I screamed until my voice was hoarse, but it was all like an echo in the deep pit. Then I saw David look up at me one last time, his lips moving, "Sorry." Immediately after, the ghost tightened, and the light in his eyes went out. I woke up, saw David lying motionless on the floor. His breathing had stopped, his lifeless eyes wide open. I trembled and hugged him, sobbing. The woman stood silently behind, her face expressionless, as if she had completed the curse. I screamed to ask why, but only received cold silence. The cabin was filled with the smell of blood and smoke, like a closed grave. I tried to pull David out, but when I stepped out the door, the forest disappeared. Only an endless black void surrounded me. I realized I was trapped forever. I could no longer run, no longer escape. Every effort was a joke. I knelt down, holding my friend's body, and the ghost watched in silence. She didn't need to kill me, because the loneliness and fear were enough to destroy the rest of me. In the days that followed, I no longer knew if I was awake or dreaming. The cabin was still there, but David was gone. I heard him calling my name in the night, but every time I looked around, I saw only an empty room. I began to wonder if I was still alive, or if I had long since died with him. As I write these last lines, I know this is not just a scary story. This is my truth, a nightmare I will never escape. And if anyone reads or hears it, remember that there are scary stories, not for entertainment, but for warning. This cabin, this ghost, and David's death, they are all real. I don't know how long it will be before I disappear like him, but one thing is for sure: if you hear someone calling your name in your dream, never answer, because that could be the beginning of a story that you will never escape from.